Welcome to the OnTarget HTML5 website YouTube channel. OnTarget HTML5 is dedicated to teaching web development technologies in HTML5, HTML, CSS, CSS3, PHP, MySQL, Flash, and the XML scripting language. We'll also be adding a JavaScript section to the website over the next few months. I hope you enjoy the tutorial. Welcome back to the CSS3 Essential Training Series. I'm Mike King, and in this tutorial we will be discussing the box model part 3. All right, as we do in the beginning of all our tutorials, let's go and confirm that our environment is set up and ready to go for our tutorial demonstrations. I'm going to go ahead and minimize that presentation. First thing we want to do is check to make sure that our XAMPP Apache web server is up and running in our development environment so that we can actually go through our exercise files. Let's go ahead and minimize that. Let me explain the structure that we have for our tutorial demonstrations for this particular tutorial. You'll notice I'm in the 03 box model tutorial. I've got the same directory structure that we've had set up in the past. I've got my CSS directory with my main.css in it from the previous exercise, my images folder, which we're not using as of yet, my basic template, and my box model 03._01.html file. That 03_01 is the exact same file that we finished with in the 02 tutorial _07. So we've just saved it as 0301 and brought it into our 0301 directory for the box model part 3. I'm also going to go ahead and bring up our web browser. You'll notice I'm in the 03, the box model part 3 portion of the web directory. I've got my CSS and images folder and the 0301 HTML file. I'm going to bring up my text editor, Sublime Text 2, which I will be using for this demonstration. And we are ready to go to actually begin looking at more information on the box model in CSS. Just to reemphasize one of the things that we discussed as we closed out part 2 of the tutorial series, we were discussing about how the padding and the borders actually add to the width of these areas and actually force that content area to shrink down based on the fixed width that it has in the body element. If I were to increase the border around the paragraph tags, let's say we made them 15 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and save that change. You're going to notice when I refresh my browser window, it's going to force the content area because, again, we're constrained to the body element. It's going to force that content area smaller in order to allow that 15 pixel border to occur. So you'll actually see the content area shrink in as we add that 15 pixels to it. And the reason being is because we're constrained by this body element. We've actually given it a fixed width of 400 pixels. It cannot exceed that. So we're forcing the content area to shrink down to stay within that area and still allow my 15 pixel border. So I mean, there's a lot of things that you've got to consider. I'm going to go ahead and put that back. A lot of things that you need to consider when you're working on your websites and designing your flow. But keep in mind how the padding, the border impact the content area of your HTML elements. It's very important, and the better you understand this, the easier it will be for you to design your pages. So up to this point, we've had a pretty good discussion on content area, on padding, and on borders around that content area. So now let's go look at margins and see how they impact our HTML elements as we begin to add margins to our layouts. All right, one of the things I want to do before we move forward, because we're going to start playing with margins now, I want to go back into our body element right down in here, and I want to remove this div container ID. And the reason I want to do this is because now as we start formatting these margins, I don't want to have that background color in that particular div. I want you to be able to see the separation between the divs as we start working with margins. So I want you to remove that container ID. Now would be a good time to pause the tutorial if you don't have a copy of the exercise files. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. I want to save this as 03_02. I'm going to go ahead and reload that. If you keep in mind now, you're seeing this background for the div ID. This is our actual container. And you'll see now that when we reload this, and we go ahead and refresh our screen, let's reload that 02 file. You'll notice now we no longer have that large container that's holding everything in, and we're looking at just our paragraphs and the divs that actually contain those paragraphs. That may have been a little confusing in some of the earlier tutorials. I hope it wasn't. Actually, it didn't have a lot of impact as to what we were doing there, but it will have as we move forward, so I wanted to remove it out before we move into looking at the margins. So again, just go into your body element, remove the div with the ID of container, save your file as 03_02, and then let's start talking about the margins. All right, so let's demonstrate the impact that a margin would have on our div elements on our HTML page. And notice right now everything is very snug against each other. We're very snug against the top of the HTML element, and each div is snug against itself, and they're both right up to the edge of the body element, which we've given a width of 400 pixels. If I go down to this div now and I give it a margin, I'm going to give it a 10 pixel margin around all four sides. That's why I'm just going to say margin, colon, 10 pixels, semicolon. I'm going to go ahead and save that file. And again, that's under example 2 in your exercise files if you need to get it from there. If not, go ahead and pause and just type that in. But when I refresh my browser window, you'll notice now I've picked up 10 pixels of padding around the top. I've actually pushed 10 pixels away from the top of the HTML element, 10 pixels away from my body on the left and right hand side, and I have 10 pixels of spacing between the top div and the bottom div. If you're really sharp, someone probably said, well, wait a minute, why isn't that 20 pixels of spacing? Because technically I've got 10 pixels of spacing on the top of the bottom div and 10 pixels of spacing on the bottom of the top div. Shouldn't that be 20 pixels? And you're going to see as we start working through more of these exercises, that's what's called margin or vertical margin collapse. When we're putting margins on two elements that are one on top of the other, the largest margin will take precedent and the smaller margin will collapse. So if I were to have 15 pixels on the top div, 10 pixels on the bottom div, my space between the top and bottom divs would not be 25 pixels, but it would actually be 15 because the 10 pixels would actually collapse, or called margin collapse. So let's look a little bit more at some of the margin things that we need to consider when we're putting margins on the elements in HTML. All right, so based on what we've just seen with this little demonstration in the margins, let's drop back into our presentation so I can demonstrate to you how you actually calculate the total width and height of these elements in HTML, including the margins. All right, so real quick, let's talk about some of the settings we're going to look at in the presentation. We want to remember that we've got a 400 pixel width for our body element. That's our container. That's what it's going to limit that width to. We also want to keep in mind that we've put in 15 pixels of padding, a 1 pixel border, and 10 pixels of margin. We also have 2 pixels of border on this P tag, but as I'll point out, that does not really calculate it into the overall width as it's inside. That border actually resides inside that content element. So it actually, if I had a 200 pixel content element in width and I added a 2 pixel border to it, the actual width of the content element would be 198 pixels because it actually comes off the overall width of that element. So let's go look in the presentation now and discuss how we can calculate the available content width based on that 400 pixels, the 15 pixels of padding, 1 pixel border, and the 10 pixels of margin. So based on those settings we just looked at, how much content space do we actually have? Well, we have to remember, based on our body selector, we have 400 pixels of available width. We know that we have a 15 pixel worth of padding around the entire element, so that's top, bottom, right, and left. 15 pixels worth of padding. We also know that we've added a 10 pixel margin around the entire element, which is top, bottom, right, and left. We also have a 1 pixel border around our div element. And we have a 2 pixel border around the actual paragraph, but this limits the content width by that amount, so it's not really counted into the overall width. So based on the settings that we have to calculate, the 15, the 10, and the 1, we have 30 pixels of padding. Remember, we have it on the right and left side, so that's 30 pixels, plus the 20 pixels of margin, which is also available on the right-hand side, and it's going to decrease our content width. And we have a 1 pixel border around the div element, which actually is going to give us 2 pixels total. So we have 52 pixels of predefined space, and our actual content width, based on all the settings that we've put into the demonstration, is 348 pixels. Well, there you have it. We've covered the basic elements of the box model in CSS. You will learn much more about the box model as you go through the rest of the CSS tutorials and the HTML tutorials, because there's a lot of things we haven't covered. But you now have a good enough understanding of the box model to proceed with laying out our web pages. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can be notified of tutorials as they're posted.
And don't forget, check out our website, www.ontargethtml5.com, for a complete listing of all the tutorials that are available for viewing. There's many more than we don't have posted up on YouTube. I look forward to your feedback, and thank you for visiting the OnTarget HTML5 YouTube channel.